About the Ebola crisis with Republican Congressman Steve Scalise of Louisiana. He's the House Majority Whip. Congressman, you want a travel ban, right? You don't want people from those 3 West Africa countries to be allowed into the United States for the time being. Is that right?
Right. What I've asked for is the president to institute that travel ban until such time that they can ensure that people coming over from those Western African countries won't be bringing Ebola with them. And they can't make that assurance right now. So again, they've got to get these protocols right. They're not ready to do that yet. And so at that point, we know in an isolated way where this disease is coming from. We want to make sure it doesn't come into the United States more than it has.
What about non-Liberians or people from Sierra Leone or Guinea? What if an American is there? Should that American citizen who happened to be there for the last few months be allowed to come back home?
Well, if they've been in contact with someone who has Ebola, at least have that 21-day gestation period where you can determine whether or not they contracted Ebola. And then at a minimum, again, if you won't put a travel ban in place, President Obama ought to at least look at ensuring that non-U.S. citizens are not issued visas to come into the United States from those 3 nations. Again, until we can determine that Americans will be safe and that Ebola won't be brought into our country more than it already has.
Congress, you want Congress to take specific action to protect Americans from Ebola, right?
The president is the one.
Because I'm wondering what Congress, forget
Right.
about the president for a moment, is there anything Congress can do?
Congress has done everything it needs to do, and in fact, you had a hearing today where earlier the CDC has expressed that he's got all the resources he needs from Congress. They surely didn't ask for any additional resources today. If they need more, we will work with them to give that to them. But in the meantime, the president has some very specific things he can do today to protect Americans even more than he has.
If they ask for more money, will Congress appropriate more money?
If they show a need for more money, we will make sure that they have all the tools that they need, and that has not been an issue. They surely didn't express any need for more money today.
One of the concerns is that these forced budget cuts over the last couple of years reduce the opportunities for NIH, for the CDC, for others to come up, for example, with a vaccine to deal with Ebola. Is that a fair criticism?
The agencies haven't said that. Some people that are trying to politicize it made that claim. They've been issued 4 Pinocchios by some of the outside think tanks. But ultimately, if you look at the money they've gotten, CDC's gotten a 200% increase in their budget since 2000. They've gotten additional funds. They have all the funds they need, most importantly, now to get through this crisis. And if they need any additional funds, we'll work with them.
Because NIH people over there, they've complained that their money isn't where it should be.
Well, they ought to change some of those priorities. In fact, we've questioned some of the funding priorities at some of those agencies where they're studying monkeys drinking alcohol and other things that I don't think should be their top priority. They have the ability to shift those dollars around. Again, if they have any impediments to that, they could have brought them to our attention today. They surely didn't. But money has not been an issue. It surely wasn't raised as an issue. They've got to get better about the protocols. That's where there is a serious breakdown. It's not just members of Congress. You've had groups like Doctors Without Borders, Samaritan's Purse, other agencies who've worked with Ebola patients in those Western African countries for decades that have recently said that CDC's protocols are lax. And in fact, one of the officials with Samaritan's Purse told CDC that, and he said he was blown off. And I asked the head of the CDC about that. He ought to be concerned about it. We don't want a culture over there of taking this issue lightly. And if he's got people in his agency that are blowing people off who know how to do this better, he ought to find out who they are and fire them.
Dr. Tom Frieden is the director of the CDC. You have confidence in him?
I have some real questions that I presented to him, and he didn't give answers yet.
Today.
I think he ought to today in the committee hearing, and he ought to give the American people those answers, not just questions that I asked for concerns in my district and beyond my district, but questions that other members of the committee, Republican and Democrat, asked. He still didn't answer a number of those questions. He ought to come forward with that, be very transparent, and address the problems, even within his own agency. If there are problems, he ought to go and clean those out. If there are employees that haven't taken this seriously enough, questions were raised about one of the nurses who called in and said she had a fever, can she get on a plane? And someone at CDC said, yes, get on the plane. Is he finding out who those people are at his agency? Are they taking their job seriously
But you're not ready to call for his resignation yet.
No,
some of your colleagues are already doing that.
I want him to have a higher level of accountability for people within his agency. And again, if somebody at one of these organizations that works with people in Africa for decades says that CDC is lax, and then someone at CDC blew him off, the CDC head ought to be the first one to find out who that was and have that person fired.
You represent Louisiana, at least parts of Louisiana, including part of New Orleans. Are the hospitals in your district ready to deal? If somebody showed up in an emergency room in one of the hospitals in your district in Louisiana, would they be ready to deal with that?
I've spoken to hospital officials and other medical officials in my district in southeast Louisiana, and they said one of the big frustrations they have is that they continue to get mixed signals from the CDC. Ultimately, CDC sends protocols, not just to the Texas hospital in Dallas, but to all the hospitals across the country, and they continue to change and move the goalpost. They want to see consistency. They want to see a more aggressive approach in what those consistent protocols are, and they haven't gotten them yet. But they're ready. They're going to handle it however they can, but they haven't gotten clear direction yet from CDC.
But do they have the protective gear to protect nurses and doctors if somebody walks in with Ebola and is showing the symptoms, has the fever, vomiting, stuff like that? Do they have all the gear that they need to make sure that they don't get sick?
I can't speak to whether each individual hospital has all the gear they need. I know that they've been following the CDC protocols. Their frustration is those protocols change sometimes on a weekly basis, which makes it very hard to have confidence and credibility that the information that they're telling their employees to follow, ultimately when it changes again, people start questioning whether or not there's confidence that that's going to work.
What we don't want to see in Louisiana or indeed any place around the United States is somebody who was just in Liberia show up with 103 temperature and they send them back home and they say, take some aspirin.
And that's why we said when CDC still cannot give that level of confidence today that everybody knows how to be treated that comes here, shouldn't we go to the source and say, don't let anybody in that's had contact with someone from Ebola from those 3 countries until you know that you can handle them properly in America.
Congressman Steve Scalise, the Majority Whip, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf. Great to be with you.
Coming up.